Hello, friends. Today is February 1st. I am re-recording the Bible Gospel of Matthew because it didn't go through yesterday. Sorry about that. But anyway, here we are. So the book of Matthew is the first gospel in the four gospels of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John are the two apostles who wrote about Jesus. Well, many of them wrote about Jesus, but the two that landed in the version of the Bible that most people know as the Bible, the St. James version or other versions, include those four gospels. The Gnostic gospels and the Nag Hammadi have other books written by apostles. They weren't part of the four gospels of the New Testament for reasons I don't know about, but someone decided that these were the ones that would best represent Jesus and his teachings. And so that is what we have today in the Bible. It doesn't mean that those other books aren't useful. And also, we want to remember that the Bible rates on David Hawkins' scale at 540, which is in the category of love, which is right where Jesus meant to bring us all. So in that case, it's a good place to be. So I'm going to begin by talking about Matthew. If you've seen Chosen, or you know a little bit about the apostles, Matthew was one of the last apostles to be chosen, and he was a tax collector, and so not very well liked by the Jews or the Romans, because he was kind of a traitor to the Jews by imposing the tax laws of the Romans, and he made money on that. And the Romans didn't really respect any Jews, so he wasn't really in with them either. But he was very meticulous. I think they did a good job of showing that in the series The Chosen. In the beginning of the gospel is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. So in the old prophecies, it was prophesied that Jesus would be, that the Messiah would be born in the house of David. So he goes through the painstaking 14 generations from Abraham to David and 14 generations from David to Jesus. So this is what he's doing, is outlining. This is why we know that Jesus is from the house of David, as the prophecy said the Messiah would be. So many times throughout the book of Matthew, he refers back to the Old Testament prophecies of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, other prophets in the Old Testament, because he's trying to show the direct line that Jesus is the Messiah. He is the Savior that we've been waiting for. So in the Judaic tradition, they've been waiting and praying, as we know from reading Valtorta about Mother Mary, praying for the Messiah to come. And finally, he's here. So Matthew goes about trying to prove that Jesus is the Messiah. He's doing this for the Jewish people, and he's doing this for the people that will be hearing the news about Jesus as the apostles go across the lands. So it's the book that tells the story of Jesus in relation to the Jewish tradition, and also in relation to the lessons or the teachings that he has for the people. So it starts with the birth of Jesus. We've just come through Advent. We know about that story, about the birth of Jesus, the angel coming to Mary, her immaculate conception of Jesus, her meeting with Elizabeth, and the baby in Elizabeth's womb, who was John the Baptist, jumps in the womb and informs her that this is the Messiah. So the otherworldly beings are helping to make sure that those who need to know. The angel showing up to the shepherds who came to adore the baby. So we want to be thinking about this in not only the historical sense of the prophecies, but also in the interdimensional or heavenly sense of angels were sent to help all along the way. The Magi were informed because of a star, and they came. So this also was prophesied. The escape into Egypt, when the Magi left and King Herod decided to kill all the babies, and that is also prophecy. Under the massacre of the infants, a voice was heard in Ramah, wailing and loud lamentation, Rachel weeping for her children. So all of these things happened in around the time of Jesus' birth. All were prophesied in the Old Testament. That's important to remember for the validation or verification that this is actually the Christ. And as you probably know, in the Jewish tradition, some people who learned about Jesus, learned about this connection, or saw him and were healed by him, followed him and believed he was the Messiah. And then the Judaic tradition of his time, which was very corrupt and conservative, they did not believe him. And so they accused him, and they, Herod tried to kill him. Herod was a say politician. He was a king. He wasn't a Jewish leader, and he wasn't a Roman leader. So the beginning of Matthew is telling who is Jesus, where did he come from, how is he reflecting the prophecies? And then it goes to the return from Egypt. And then it goes right into the story of John the Baptist and the baptism of Jesus. So in between those years, if we read Maria Valtorta, we hear a lot about what happened to Jesus as a young boy, as a child, him growing up with Mary and Joseph and his cousins. And then there's a period of time that seems to be the lost years of Jesus. And many people think, and with some backup in writings, that he went to the East to learn. He learned from the Essene community, which was an esoteric community of his time that Mary and Joseph were said to be part of. And then he also learned from the Eastern traditions. And that's why you see many of those things reflected in the teachings that he brings forward. But those years are not documented in what we call the Bible. And so we're not going to go into a lot of that. That's a lot of speculation, a lot of things that you could read that say otherwise, and that's a study for a different day. But as we get into the second half the second half of Jesus's life, which has to do with him starting his mission. So his father dies, he leaves home, tells Mother Mary it's time, and then he goes and finds John the Baptist. Now, the Baptist has been baptizing people all along, but doesn't seem to have a close relationship with Jesus. So when Jesus comes, it's surprising to him, but also he sees the signs that this is the one. And so he baptizes Jesus, even though he tells Jesus, I think you should baptize me. And Jesus said, everything has to be fulfilled. So Jesus is aware of the prophecies. John is aware of the prophecies. Mary, Joseph, all of them are aware of the prophecies, not only of the birth and life of Jesus, but the death of Jesus. So remembering that they're fulfilling a prophecy, they're living out the prophecy of the Old Testament. So Jesus is baptized, and then, as you know, he goes into the desert for 40 days. We talked the other day about 40 days being a period of strengthening, a period of temptation and testing, and a period of preparation for the next thing that's coming. So he was in the desert praying and fasting for 40 days. Satan came and tried to tempt him to give up his mission for power, for money, for women, for all these things. And he did not fall into those temptations. He succeeded, and he had victory over those temptations. And then he stepped back into the world to begin his mission. And he began his mission in Galilee and begins by gathering the disciples. So as we read the other day, John and James came to him first, and then Andrew and Peter, and then Thaddeus, and so they started to come to him, as did a lot of other people who were recognizing him through John the Baptist's testimony, through the testimony of John and James and Andrew and Peter and all the others that were coming along. He was starting to get a reputation, and he was starting to do things like heal people and teach people. And he did the healings wherever he went. And so he was getting a reputation as he traveled around, showing people that he had the power to heal. Now, all along, the Sadducees and Pharisees, those are the religious leaders of the Judaic tradition and the kind of lawyers of the Judaic tradition, or the scholars, they were questioning, doubting, persecuting him, asking him, telling people that his powers were from Satan, not from God, doing everything they could to put him into disrepute. So that's happening parallel to his mission. He's healing. He goes to, he gathers people for teachings. And one of the most famous teachings that people know about is the Beatitudes, when he talks about, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the dominion of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. That section is Matthew chapter 5. And that's him proclaiming, when you take on the aspects of the Christ, or the aspects that God wants you to have, you will be protected, comforted, supported, and you will be able to see the face of God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall see the pure in heart will see God, and the peacemakers will be called the children of God. So that's the Beatitudes, very well-known passage. And then he goes on he continues to teach, and he's teaching in what are called parables. Parables are short lessons that are metaphors for the spiritual life that he is teaching to the people, the common people, mostly the common people. And so many of these people are peasants, probably illiterate, and he's telling them stories that they can understand. For example, the story Salt and Light. He says, "You're the salt of the earth. If the salt has lost its savor, what good is it? It's only good to be thrown away." So he's talking about keeping the light shining in yourself and and shining the truth that you know and not hiding it. So salt we know adds flavor to food, and it kind of magnifies the flavor of the food. And so he's saying that you have to keep that going in you. You have to keep that going in you. So again, he's talking about the prophets. He's teaching on things like anger and adultery and divorce and retaliation, giving alms or tithing, praying, fasting. So he's teaching one thing after another. And so Matthew is keeping track of these are the teachings of Jesus during these years. When his public ministry began, there were only 3 years of public ministry before he was persecuted and crucified. So all of these teachings were happening in different places as he wandered around, teaching and healing as he went, and teaching and healing, and also doing miraculous acts. I mean, certainly healing is miraculous, but also other things like walking on water and calming a storm and things like that. So he's teaching the golden rule, which is a commandment in all traditions: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And he's sharing that message as one of the things that people need to pay attention to. And he's teaching this to the masses, but he's also talking in the temples and teaching the Pharisees and Sadducees and the Jewish priests, and he's speaking truth. And so we know when someone speaks truth, sometimes that causes a disturbance. And so he is clear that he's come to bring a sword, not peace, but a sword. And that sword is, when he speaks truth, people are going to get ruffled, and they are going to work against him and anyone who follows him. So he's warning them, if you come with me, you believe me, you live this way, the people in your life will not like that, and they might attack you, or they might betray you, or they might leave you. So he's warning them as time goes on. He's healing people, and then he stills the storm. He casts out demons from people. He heals paralyzed people. So he is going about the business in these 3 years of healing, teaching, doing miracles, chastising those who are not following God's word, and making some friends and followers, including the 12 apostles, and making some enemies in the Jewish people who are conservative, and especially the Jewish people who are in power. So he also teaches the 12 apostles. He teaches them what their mission is: to go out and evangelize, go out and share the good news, tell people who he is, and that God has given a new dispensation. That new dispensation is to follow the ways of God, to love God first and love your neighbor as yourself. And so he's telling them they have to have this moral standard that God put in place, which includes the 10 commandments, which were given to Moses. And, so as you can imagine, he's not well received in a lot of places. And he says to his apostles, if you go into a town and you're healing and blessing and teaching, and they don't want what you have, then turn and shake the sand from your feet and take your blessing with you. So he's saying, don't fight people, just move on and keep sharing the news with anybody who wants to hear it. And he also he's very chastising with people who won't receive it, saying, woe to the unrepentant cities. So we're not just talking about people who make mistakes. These are people who are going against the laws of their own tradition. So it's about corruption he's speaking to. Woe to the cities that don't listen, that it's not going to go well for them. And that the Jewish tradition was very much about the letter of the law. And so they were enforcing the dogma and doctrine of their time. And he said, it's not about the letter of the law, it's the spirit of the law that matters. so that he took away the power for them to chastise and make people feel bad or unworthy. And that, of course, the Judaic structure did not like either, because that was the power they had over the people. So again, many times there are prophecies being fulfilled in Matthew 12, 9, 15. God's chosen servant, so he is going around healing people and then telling them, don't tell anyone that I've healed you. And part of this was because it made more of a ruckus, and part of it was to fulfill, here we go, the prophecy spoken by Isaiah. Here is my servant whom I have chosen, my beloved, with whom my soul is well pleased. I will put my spirit upon my servant, who will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. My servant will not wrangle or cry aloud, nor be heard in the streets. My servant will not break a bruised reed or quench a smoldering wick, until justice is brought to victory. And in the servant's name, the Gentiles will hope. So over and over again, Matthew is going back to remind the reader that this is the Messiah, as God sent, as God promised. So he continues to do that, parable after parable after parable, which is really useful to the people that are listening to him to learn how to live. And then he is rejected in his own town. So there's a saying, a prophet is never received in their own town. And that is because Nazareth rejected him. So you can imagine seeing Jesus and knowing that he was a carpenter's son, and he wasn't anybody. And then all of a sudden he's proclaiming himself and being proclaimed as the Messiah of the Judaic culture. And people are like, what do you mean? And so he was rejected. And then on top of that rejection, he came to hear that John the Baptist was beheaded by King Herod. And so his cousin, and the one who was his precursor, and the one who he said was the reincarnation of Elijah, he had to bear the burden of that his coming was causing these things to happen. And so he was grieved by that, but also he continued his mission. The next thing that he did was the miracle of feeding the 5,000. So many, many people were gathered together, many more than 5,000, and there wasn't enough food for everyone. And so the story of the loaves and fishes were multiplied, and he fed all the people there. And that was a miracle. He walked on water. He continues to do healing people everywhere he goes. So he's gathering a following, and he's gathering a reputation. A good reputation with the followers, a not so good reputation with the ones who want to find him unworthy. And so those Pharisees and Sadducees continue to do things like show up at these gatherings and demand a sign from him, demand that he shows them his power, demand that he tells them where the power comes from. And so things are starting to heat up. And here's the time when Peter declares Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus asks him, who do you say I am? And Peter says, the Messiah. You are the Messiah, the child of the living God. So here it is coming more and more in the face of everyone, that it's not just Jesus the teacher, Rabboni, not just Jesus the healer, but Jesus the Messiah. And once that happens and all of his apostles are together, he starts to remind them that also in the prophecies are the prophecies of his death and his resurrection. So he starts to remind them of that, tells them what it means to pick up the cross, tells them what it means to be a disciple of his. And in the midst of that, he takes John and Peter and James up to the mountain and experiences the transfiguration. So the three of them watch him levitate, be filled with light, and Moses and Elijah come on either side of him. And of course, that blows their mind, and they think that they should build them houses there and worship them. But in fact, Jesus comes back down and says, don't tell anyone what you just saw. Like, that's not going to help his cause, right? Because that's going to make it seem more like he has magic, not the miracles and graces of God. And so they have to follow him and continue not speaking of all of the things that they know and see. And Jesus has to remind the apostles, has to teach them 3 times about his death, his coming death and resurrection, because they don't believe him. They see his powers, they see the miracles he can do, and they don't believe that he's going to be able to be captured and killed. But he reminds them, this is the prophecy. I came to fulfill the prophecy. I have to do that. I have to do it. And so it takes a while for them to get it. And they actually don't get it until after the resurrection, in total. So again, after that, he goes about still healing, still teaching, teaching about forgiveness, blessing children, answering the questions, the spiritual questions of his time, telling more parables, correcting people when they're wrong. Some of them like it, some of them don't. And then we come to Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So now we're at Palm Sunday of Holy Week. Jesus gets a donkey and sits on the donkey again to fulfill the prophecy. Tell this to Zion, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, and on a colt, the foal of a donkey. So he's very literally fulfilling each of the prophecies of old. And then once he gets to the town, after he's there and everyone's singing the hosannas, they're recognizing him as the Messiah, he goes to the temple and sees that the temple is being used as a market. And you all know that he turns the tables and he yells at them and whips them and says, get this out of my father's house. And that doesn't gain him any followers, of course. That causes a lot more ruckus. And people are questioning him more and more. Who are you and what are you doing? And by whose authority are you doing it? He also gives the great commandment, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Because the Pharisees and Sadducees were questioning him and says, which of the commandments given to Moses are the most important? And he said, this is the most important one, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So again, Jesus is denouncing the scribes and Pharisees. He's calling them out. He's calling them out in public. He's calling them out wherever he is. And so they're getting angry and they're trying to plot against him. And this is what happens during Holy Week, is they plot against him. And Jesus has to lament over Jerusalem and say, Jerusalem, you're going to be known for this horrible thing that happened. And this was meant to be the city of peace and the city of God. He foretells the destruction of the temple and the tearing of the Holy of Holies that will happen when he's killed. See, he's telling them in advance, the prophecy in advance, like this is what's going to happen. And some of those prophecies are the old prophecies, and some of them are him saying, I know what's going to happen. They're going to kill me. I'm going to die and come back in 3 days, and the temple will be demolished because you killed the Messiah. And that's God's sign that you killed the Messiah. And so he's not getting, making many friends with the Jewish powers that be at the time. He's teaching the apostles and followers to be watchful, to pray, to remember him, to be ever watchful, not only now, but after he dies, after the resurrection, to be watchful for how God is moving, and that God will judge the nations. And so now it's getting so bad for the Pharisees and Sadducees in Jerusalem that they're starting to plot to kill him. And we know, of course, that Judas joins with them, takes money in order to betray Jesus. And on the Thursday of Holy Week is the Last Supper, which for them was the supper before their Paschal ceremony. And so they were at the supper. There was the institution of the Eucharist. So Jesus held the wine and the bread and told them to remember him through this taking bread and wine. And then he washed their feet and told them, you have to be a servant. If you want to follow me, you have to let me serve you. And then you serve also. That's the way that this works. It's not about becoming a king and all powerful. It's about serving others. Jesus has to tell Peter that he's going to deny him. And Peter says, I would never do that, of course. And then Jesus says, well, you're going to 3 times before tomorrow, you're going to do that. And that is a test for Peter, and a test that made it so that he became very, very humble and very, very dedicated after he does, in fact, deny Peter. Then we know he goes to Gethsemane and prays and takes on the sins of the world and sweats blood and and asks John and James and Peter to stay awake and pray, and they fall asleep, and he has to do it on his own. He's there alone. God's not with him. His followers are not with him. He's alone carrying that burden. And then just on the heels of that, Judas betrays him with a kiss, and the Romans come in and arrest him and persecute him and beat him and whip him and eventually convince the powers that be to crucify him. So that's the story that we'll look into more deeply in Holy Week and during Lent. But this is the ending part of the book of Matthew, is the story of Holy Week, of Peter denying Jesus, of Jesus going to Pilate, of Judas killing himself, of Pilate handing him over to be crucified, and then, of course, the crucifixion and the death. And that gets us through Good Friday, the death of Jesus on the cross. And Holy Saturday is where everyone is lamenting and mourning him. And then, of course, on Easter Sunday, he arises, resurrects from the dead. So the last two sections just have to do with his resurrection and him commissioning the disciples. So he resurrects, and what does he do? He goes about teaching and healing and doing all those things over again and telling his followers what they'll need to do next. So he sets them up for, I have to go, I'm going to go ascend into heaven. I'm going to go make a place for you in my Father's kingdom. And you're going to have to get out there and continue this mission. You're the continuers. And that is the end of the book of Matthew. So the things to remember about Matthew are, he was an apostle himself. He taught with Jesus, he learned from Jesus. He followed Jesus. He was a witness to many of Jesus's miracles and healings. He heard the teachings. He noted the teachings. He shared not only the lineage and the fulfillment of prophecy, but also many, many of the teachings of Jesus and what was happening in that time kind of politically in the religious structure of his time. And there are still people in the Judaic tradition who are waiting for the Messiah, and they don't believe that Jesus was that person, was that one who came. And then Christianity arose out of the Messiah coming and people following the new dispensation of the Messiah. There are some Jewish people kind of in the middle. I remember when I was on campus, there was a group called Jews for Jesus. So there are Jews by tradition and in their family line, but they choose to believe that Jesus is the Messiah. So that makes the Bible that has the Old Testament and the New Testament in a kind of a continuation, which is really what it's meant to be, a continuation. But it's not a continuation for those who say, no, he wasn't the one, it's somebody else. We're still waiting. We're still praying for that one. And in the meantime, we're doing good works and trying to, be good people and praise God and all of that. So that's the book of Matthew. We have 3 other books to go through. The next one is Mark. We'll talk about that next time. Apologies for the misrecording yesterday, but I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson on the Bible, and I'll continue making short lessons so that you can get a sense for the stories and why they're in this book that we call the Good Book or the Holy Bible. I do also recommend highly that you watch the series called Chosen. They did a really good job of representing Jesus and the apostles, the love of Jesus, his gentleness and his strength, and also how the apostles are going through their own formation during those 3 years that they're walking around with Jesus in his ministry and supporting him in his ministry, making it possible for him to do all the things that he did. Remembering too that Jesus went to the mountains to pray and meditate, that he liked to surround himself with children. He also had consolations during this time that helped him, and his apostles were consolations as well. And sometimes they failed him, like at Gethsemane and at the cross, where they all scattered. And John, Mary, and Mary Magdalene were the 3 at the foot of the cross, plus some of the women disciples. But all the rest of the apostles took off. So the stories that we're hearing are telling us the basis and the kind of cliff notes of what Jesus did. Now that was, that short book of Matthew is meant to cover the whole of Jesus's life and mission. And if we read Valtorta, that's 5 volumes of Valtorta with a lot of very specific detail. So if you are a reader and you like that kind of thing, if you went through the first volume of Valtorta during Advent, you could continue on and see Jesus in action, teaching, praying, healing, doing miracles over and over again, this happening over and over again through the volume 2, 3, and 4. And volume 5 is the story of the persecution, crucifixion, resurrection, ascension, and the Assumption of Mary. So from the birth of Mary to the Assumption of Mary is the whole span of what Valtorta shares with us in great detail, kind of the unabridged version. So I highly recommend that. Reading those volumes really changed my life. You can find them for free online in PDF form, Maria Valtorta, Poem of the Man God. And you can find Chosen, the series on Netflix or on the Angel Network. You can find those. So those are other ways to support your understanding of the Bible and your understanding of Jesus's life. And we'll talk about the book of Mark next time. All right, peace.